Miss Marple notices what no one else does. A trail of biscuit crumbs at a crime scene that leads her from a quiet tea table to the shocking truth of a hidden killer. Chapter 1. The garden party interrupteth late spring sun draped Elmstead on Avon in a golden glow, bathing the neatly trimmed lawns of Briarwood Manor in warm light. Mrs. Beatrice Harcourt, the vicar's wife, fluttered among her prized rose beds, smoothing the petals of a newly opened Constance Spry with gloved hands. Nearby, a village band tuned their brass instruments under the watchful eye of Mr. Llewellyn, the retired schoolmaster, whose spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. Above them all, white bunting danced in a playful breeze, promising a delightful afternoon of tea, cakes, and gentle gossip at a round wrought-iron table strewn with lace cloths and porcelain teacups. Miss Marple observed the scene with calm detachment. Dressed in a simple pale blue frock and a straw hat adorned with forget-me-nots, she looked every bit the little old lady her neighbors assumed her to be. Yet beneath her mild smile and quietly clasped hands, her keen gray eyes missed nothing, the way Mrs. Harcourt's fingers trembled as she carried a silver tray, the too bright note of laughter in Clarissa Danvers's voice as she exchanged pleasantries, the furtive glances of the vicar's curate, Reverend Goodenow, toward a dark corner of the hedgerow. It was just such attention to small details that had earned Miss Marple her reputation, though nobody outside her circle named it as such. To them, she was simply Spinster Jane from Cherry Tree Cottage, adept at making everyone feel comfortable in her presence. But comfort, she understood, often masked deeper tensions. A polite murmur rose among the assembled guests as Colonel Fitzwilliam, recently returned from India, strolled down the gravel path. His crisp uniform jacket and polished boots set him slightly apart from the flower-hatted ladies and linen-clad gentlemen. He greeted Miss Marple with a bow, placing a gloved hand over his heart in mock gallantry. "Charming day for it, isn't it, Miss Marple?" he drawled, though his eyes flicked toward the bandstand, where several musicians were already playing the opening bars of the Blue Danube. "Indeed, Colonel," she replied, inclining her head. She lifted her teacup, a delicate bone china piece flecked with pale pink, and sipped. The Earl of Westbury, seated beside her, coughed politely. "A fine turnout, all things considered," he offered, his monocle sliding slightly as he peered toward the horizon. "Though I hear the rector's been positively insufferable these last few days. He's taken to lecturing on temperance at every available moment." Miss Marple allowed a small smile. "I did notice," she said, "that Reverend Goodenow declined the lemonade." As if summoned by her words, the curate emerged from the hedgerow, a disheveled letter gripped in his hand. His eyes were wide, his face ashen. He stumbled toward the assembled party, clearing his throat. "Excuse me, sorry to interrupt," he panted, "but there's been an incident." The band faltered on a high note, and the Earl dropped his teacup with an audible clink. Mrs. Harcourt's hands flew to her mouth in horror. Colonel Fitzwilliam straightened at attention, his earlier languid composure vanishing. A wave of unease rippled through the guests, cutting short their idle chatter. "Incident?" echoed Mrs. Harcourt, her voice quavering. "Whatever do you mean, Reverend?" He swallowed, glancing back toward the thick hedges that bordered the manor grounds. From there came a faint, high-pitched gasp so delicate that heard alone, one might have mistaken it for a bird in distress. But now, as more guests strained to listen, a harsh cry followed, and then, abruptly, a thud. A murmur of alarm swept through the group. Several of the younger women clutched their skirts. The vicar himself, who had been greeting newcomers at the gate, hurried forward, his cassock flapping like a banner in the breeze. He placed a steadying hand on his curate's shoulder. "Calm yourself, Goodenow. Tell us what's happened." Reverend Goodenow glanced down at the letter in his hand, as though seeking guidance. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It's Lady Winfield." She's been attacked. I found her just now, behind the hydrangea bushes. I thought at first she'd fainted, but her face was—" He broke off, shuddering. The vicar exchanged a look with Miss Marple, whose tranquil expression never wavered. "Come along." Then the vicar commanded, "Show me where." A knot of curious onlookers followed as the vicar and his curate hurried toward the hedges. Miss Marple rose, folding her lace handkerchief with care. Colonel Fitzwilliam offered her his arm, but she shook her head. "I think I'll go on ahead," she said softly. "It may be nothing more than a sprained ankle, or perhaps Lady Winfield simply took a turn." She placed one hand on the Earl's arm. "But one must not delay." Her voice, so gentle, carried an unspoken certainty. Moments later, the throng parted to reveal a pale form lying amid the crushed purple blooms of the hydrangeas. A shocked gasp rose as Lady Margaret Winfield, in her embroidered silk gown, lay motionless, one slender hand brushing the blossoms. Her eyes fluttered open, and she let out a single, fragile cry before closing them again. The vicar bent to check for pulse. Colonel Fitzwilliam drew his sword cane with a flourish, as though preparing to defend against an unseen assailant. Several villagers, struggling to maintain propriety, peered from behind their fans, and Miss Marple, stepping lightly over the soft earth, knelt beside Lady Winfield. She raised the victim's wrist, feeling for a heartbeat. Then she allowed her keen gaze to travel upward, to the neat smudge of biscuit crumbs at the corner of Lady Winfield's mouth, to the tiny bruise forming at her temple, to the overturned teacup that lay half buried in the foliage. "No sprained ankle," she murmured. But then Lady Winfield never did take tea without a biscuit. Her words fluttered through the gathering like a moth's wings, and in that instant, the peaceful garden party became a crime scene, and the gentle hum of village life was shattered by the faint, insistent promise of buried secrets waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. A ripple of consternation coursed through Elmstead-on-Avon as news of Lady Winfield's collapse spread. Beyond the confines of Briarwood Manor's rose hedges, in the snug parlors of neighboring cottages, tea trays shook in startled hands. In the village shop, Mrs. Pritchard paused mid-sentence while weighing sugar, and at the post office, Mr. Abbott set down his pen, frowning at the telegram he had just begun to write. By the time Reverend Goodenough shuffled back onto the lawn, guided by the vicar and flanked by Miss Marple and Colonel Fitzwilliam, a chorus of whispers followed in his wake. Miss Marple surveyed the assembly with cool disinterest. Though her mind worked swiftly, she had noted the biscuit crumbs at Lady Winfield's mouth, so ordinary, yet so telling, and now she listened for patterns in the frantic exchanges around her. Voices rose and fell in uneven cadences. "Oh, poor thing, did you see how she looked, all ashen?" murmured Mrs. Harcourt to Clarissa Danvers, her gloved fingers brushing roses she would no longer tend today. "Positively foul business," whispered Clarissa, and she glanced sidelong at the curate. "One would never expect violence in Elmstead. It's simply not done." "But what could have caused it?" asked the vicar, standing erect beside Colonel Fitzwilliam. "A stumble, a faint. I trust it was not deliberate." Lady Winfield lay on a linen sheet now, carried by two footmen toward the great house. The unspoken dread that she might not awaken hovered behind every polite phrase. Miss Marple's eyes followed the dark smear on the hydrangea petals, the slight imprint of a heel at the edge of the path, the overturned saucer staining the earth. Each fragment offered a thread to be woven into a tapestry of motive and opportunity. Colonel Fitzwilliam cleared his throat. "We shall escort her indoors at once," he announced, though there was no dissent among the onlookers. The vicar offered to accompany the party, but Miss Marple gently shook her head. "Best you remain here with our guests," she advised. "I shall see Lady Winfield attended." He hesitated, admiration flickering behind his courteous smile. then inclined his head and fell back into the circle of villagers forming around Mrs. Harcourt. Miss Marple rose and followed the bearers, her skirts whispering across the grass. Within moments, she stood in the grand hall of Briarwood Manor, whose lofty ceilings and oak paneling usually bespoke festivity rather than calamity. Lady Winfield lay on a chaise longue, pale as the lace that framed her neckline. A physician's bag sat open nearby, and Dr. Pemberton, summoned in haste, knelt to feel for a pulse. His forehead creased in concentration, remarkably faint, but present. He announced after a long moment. He straightened and regarded Miss Marple. "Shall we move her to the drawing room? The heating is on there. She may revive more comfortably." "By all means," Miss Marple agreed. She noted the slight slope of Lady Winfield's chin, the way her delicate hand clutched at the embroidered cushion. It was a posture that suggested surprise rather than collapse, a startled gasp, perhaps, before the body gave way. But surprise at what? A question that would need an answer in due course. Dr. Pemberton and a footman lifted Lady Winfield onto the drawing-room settee, wheeling a brass lamp closer to warm her. Miss Marple sank into a chair opposite, gathering her wits. Beyond the broad windows, voices drifted from the lawn, the sound of Mrs. Harcourt directing anxious guests toward refreshment, Colonel Fitzwilliam standing vigilant among them, and the low murmur of doubtful theories. That was where the heart of a mystery lay, in the gulf between perception and reality, in the gaps where gossip and, more dangerously, fear could fill in with falsehoods. Miss Marple's mind turned to the earlier words of the curate, his voice trembling as he spoke of an attack. Attack. The suggestion was potent, but so was the evidence of mere physical distress. No wound showed on Lady Winfield's form, only that pale bruise near the temple and the crumbs on her lips. She stood and stepped to a side table, where the silver teapot gleamed. A sugar bowl, half full, bore the imprint of a spoon. Miss Marple picked up the spoon and studied it. Its handle was smudged. Anxiety or haste, she could not yet tell. She replaced it gently, then turned toward the door as footsteps approached. It was Colonel Fitzwilliam, his uniform slightly rumpled, his usually composed expression tinged with concern. He executed a crisp bow. "May I join you, Miss Marple? I trust Lady Winfield is in capable hands. Dr. Pemberton assures me she shall recover." Miss Marple replied, keeping her tone even. "It may be wise to avoid conjecture until she can speak for herself." He nodded. "True, yet villagers have already begun to whisper of foul play." He hesitated, then added, "One hears all sorts of tales. Some say they saw Mr. Danvers near the hedges just before the incident. Others mention a stranger glimpsed riding through the lane." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Indeed, Mr. Danvers is Clarissa's husband, I believe. A retired barrister, hardly a man given to violence, and a stranger would surely be noted by more than one pair of eyes." Colonel Fitzwilliam raised an eyebrow. "But in Elmstead, a stranger is a rarity. Even the vicar's wife might mistake a passing traveler for someone noteworthy." "Then we shall keep an open mind," Miss Marple said gently. "Descriptions will vary with fear or imagination. Best to rely on facts." He inclined his head, as though privately admiring her restraint. "I shall leave you, then. If I may be of any assistance—" "Thank you, Colonel. Your presence here is help enough." She escorted him to the door, all the while noting his alert posture and quick glances. Something in him sought order, but it was the human element, his own dealings with strangers and society, that gave him his edge. He, like Miss Marple, thrived on observation. Back in the hall, Miss Marple paused as Mrs. Harcourt swept past, her face streaked with tears and rouge. Mrs. Harcourt halted at sight of Miss Marple, lifting a gloved hand in greeting that trembled as it fell. "Dear Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice thick, "I simply cannot bear it. Why would anyone harm Margaret? She's the sweetest soul in the county." Miss Marple offered a comforting nod. "People do foolish things when secrets burden them, but let us not assume the worst until we know more." Mrs. Harcourt shook her head, as if to shake free her own dark thoughts. Yes, of course. Forgive me," she hurried on, toward a cluster of relatives who had arrived and now clutched one another's hands. In the corridor beyond, Miss Marple found Reverend Goodenough, pale and jittery. He stood with his back against the wall, ringing the letter that had brought him to the garden. "Reverend," she said, stepping forward, "may I see that letter?" He looked up, startled. "Oh yes, Miss Marple." He offered the paper with a shaking hand. Miss Marple smoothed it flat. It was an invitation formal, printed on heavy card requesting Lady Winfield's attendance at a luncheon in London. The date was printed boldly, the very next day. A small postscript wrote, in ink, "Do bring that delicious batch of almond biscuits." "A luncheon invitation," Miss Marple murmured. "Nothing untoward here, though perhaps someone wished to hasten Lady Winfield's reply." She returned the card. "Thank you, Reverend." He stared at her as though unaccustomed to scrutiny. "I suppose so." She offered him a small, understanding smile. "We will have more clarity in due course. Now, try to rest." He nodded and shuffled away. Clutching his clerical collar. Miss Marple retraced her steps to the drawing room, where Dr. Pemberton had arranged a screen of flowering potted plants to shield Lady Winfield from curious eyes. The doctor stood at the window, peering out. "Early stages of concussion, perhaps," he told her. "I shall take her pulse again in half an hour. In the meantime, no questions, let her rest. Of course, if you will permit me, I shall remain nearby." She settled into a high-backed chair, one hand tucked in her lap, her senses alert for every footfall beyond the screen. Time ticked by in splintered fragments, the distant murmur of departing guests, the heavy footsteps of servants clearing tea settings, the soft click of the vicar's shoes on the tiled floor. Miss Marple let each sound register, cataloging them in her mind, weaving them into a silent ledger of who had been where. And when at last, Lady Winfield stirred, a pale hand swept the tendrils of hair from her forehead, and her eyes fluttered open. She blinked twice, as though unsure of her surroundings, before seeing Miss Marple seated across the room. "Jane, my dear, what happened?" she whispered, her voice fragile as spun glass. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the settee. "There's no need to speak of it if you are unwell," she said gently. "But you collapsed in the garden behind the hydrangeas." Lady Winfield's lips parted in surprise. "Garden? I don't remember." The recollection halted. She blinked again, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. Miss Marple sat beside her, retrieving a handkerchief and offering it. "Time will restore your strength," she said. "But tell me, did you taste your biscuit? Did you notice anything odd?" The question seemed to jar Lady Winfield. She frowned, thoughts gathering like wary birds. "Odd. I had been nibbling one of my own almond biscuits, my favorite recipe. But I recall no other taste. Nothing bitter? Metallic?" Miss Marple pressed, though her tone remained soft. Lady Winfield shook her head. "Only sweet almond." She sighed, and fatigue tugged at her eyelids. "I'm so tired." Miss Marple nodded. "Then rest. You'll have time to rest here." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Later, when you feel stronger, you must tell me everything. For now, know that all is under control." Gently, she placed the handkerchief back on the side table and left the room. In the hall, voices rose once more, driven by rumor, propelled by fear. Miss Marple paused, inhaling the scent of roses and old wood, and smiled to herself. Curiosity, once piqued, would not easily relinquish its hold. Secrets, like biscuit crumbs, might lie scattered in unlikely places, but each crumb, she knew, could lead to the heart of something far more sinister than a faint in the sunlit garden. And so the village whispered on, unaware that a single quiet observer had already begun to unravel the delicate threads of truth. Chapter 3. Early investigation. Morning after the arroyo of whispers that had risen from Briarwood Manor, Elmstad-on-Avon awoke beneath a veil of gray clouds, as though the sky itself bore witness to the village's disquiet. Miss Marple, seated by her kitchen hearth with a cup of tea in hand, watched the chimney smoke curl upward and considered the events of the previous afternoon. Lady Winfield was resting at Briarwood. Dr. Pemberton assured her recovery. Yet Miss Marple knew illness and intrigue were often twin travelers. This was not a mere fainting spell. Something had unsettled Lady Winfield deeply, and the footprints of that disturbance still lingered among the rose petals and biscuit crumbs. Miss Marple's first visit of the day was to Cherry Tree Cottage, where she paused to greet Mrs. Martha Blake, who stood at her gate embroidering a handkerchief. "Good morning, Mrs. Blake," she said with gentle warmth. "May I trouble you for your thoughts on yesterday's events?" Martha set aside her needle. "Oh, Miss Marple, I hardly know where to begin. A right scandal it is. Who would think Lady Winfield so poised, so genteel would be laid low in our own back garden?" She dabbed at her eyes with a corner of her apron. "I heard she was clutching her cushion as if she'd seen a ghost." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Did you notice anything unusual before she collapsed? Any strangers in the lane, or perhaps a misplaced servant?" Martha shook her head emphatically. "No stranger came by, that I saw, nor did any footman linger where he shouldn't. But I did hear a scuffle of faint rustling, like to people shifting behind the hedges. It might have been nothing, but it startled me." Miss Marple made a mental note. Rustling behind the hedges, too soft for Colonel Fitzwilliam's authoritative gait, too hushed for boisterous gossip. "Thank you, Mrs. Blake. Your sharp ears may yet reveal more than a hurried eye." She strolled onward toward the forge, where Mr. Peter Holbrook was already at work shoeing a chestnut mare. Sparks flickered in the dim light as the hammer met the horseshoe. "Morning, Miss Marple," Holbrook greeted, wiping his brow. "Bit damp, isn't it?" "Quite," she agreed. "I wonder, Mr. Holbrook, did you happen to take Lady Winfield's mare into the village yesterday afternoon?" He paused, turning a thoughtful gaze to her. "Yes, I did. She asked for a turnabout at the smithy while the others fell to their tea. Said she'd like to inspect the petals on my new rose grafts. I left her mare in the stable." She stepped inside to look at the rosewood gate. Miss Marple leaned closer. "And when did you return to release the horse?" "A good 10 minutes later," he replied. "She was gone by then. I looked high and low, then heard the commotion at the manor. 10 minutes ample time for someone to approach unnoticed, yet too brief for a premeditated assault. The pattern of rustling and a missing person suddenly felt orchestrated." Miss Marple nodded, offering a tight smile. "Thank you, Mr. Holbrook. That is very helpful. At the vicarage." She paused only to bumble a greeting to the vicar himself and Reverend Goodenow, who seemed simultaneously eager to speak and ashamed of his earlier alarm. "Miss Marple," the vicar began, smoothing his vestments, "I trust you have found some clarity?" "I am gathering observations, Reverend," she said. "May I ask again about the letter you delivered? You said it requested Lady Winfield's almond biscuits." Goodenow's cheeks flushed pink. Yes, but so many invitations were sent that day. One can hardly give each the full scrutiny required." Miss Marple observed his discomfort and let the matter rest, only to note the physics of his shifting weight, the tight grip on his clerical collar. All small details, all telling. Her final call took her back to Briarwood Manor itself, where Lady Winfield reclined among silk cushions in the drawing room. A shaded lamp lent the room an amber glow. Miss Marple entered to find the mistress of the house fully dressed, corseted, and coiffed. Though she appeared pale and weary, "Good morning, Margaret," Miss Marple greeted, adopting the intimacy of two old friends rather than the formality of guest and host. "How do you fare?" Lady Winfield offered a wan smile. Listen closely, Dr. Pemberton says I must rest, but rest is tiresome. I want to know what happened. If it was poison, if it was accident, Jane. I am so frightened. Miss Marple seated herself on a low footstool beside Lady Winfield's settee, her posture unassuming. Let us speak of what you recall. You told me you tasted only sweet almond biscuits. Do you remember where you were when you felt faint? Lady Winfield's eyelids fluttered. I was near the hydrangeas. I remember bending to smell them. I had just slipped the biscuit to my lips. There was something odd in your invitation, Jane. It said we should meet sooner, that someone there would pay well for my recipe. That made me uneasy, but I did not think much. A flicker of triumph passed through Miss Marple's eyes. Someone offered payment for your biscuit recipe, and that person's identity. Lady Winfield frowned. I assumed it was Mrs. Danvers, Clarissa's sister. She once claimed your recipe was stolen from her mother's tombola. She paused. But I never saw her near the hedges. Intrigued, Miss Marple rose. I should like to speak to Mrs. Danvers at once. Very well, but please be gentle. Lady Winfield cautioned. Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, where a servant directed her to the drawing room. There, Clarissa Danvers stood before a tall mirror, smoothing her dress ribbons. The room was hushed, fragrant with lilies. Clarissa acknowledged Miss Marple's entrance with a curt nod. Miss Marple, she said coolly, I trust you have come to console me over this afternoon's shocks. Actually, Clarissa, Miss Marple replied, I have come to inquire about your interest in Lady Winfield's biscuit recipe. Clarissa stiffened. The smooth veneer of politeness cracked. My interest? Must we discuss trifles when our hostess has been so gravely ill? Trifles, perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, but trifles can be fatal. Clarissa colored. I merely expressed admiration for Margaret's baking. Any claim to theft was idle gossip. She turned to face the window. I was in the village shop at the time of the incident purchasing thread for my embroidery. Ask Mrs. Pritchard. She will confirm. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you. I shall. She withdrew, aware that Clarissa's eyes followed her. Narrowed in suspicion, or was it fear? The day wore on in a flurry of discreet inquiries. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Pritchard's shop, where the kindly grocer's wife offered a detailed recollection. Clarissa was here from 2:15 to 2:30, Mrs. Pritchard confirmed, buying her usual cotton. She paid in silver, no rush, and lingered to chat about my granddaughter's wedding. That placed Clarissa away from the manor at the critical moment. Yet motives seldom require presence at the scene. They can travel by letter or whisper. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on to the lane where the stranger was reportedly seen. The sun had broken through, revealing a muddy wheel rut and the faint tracks of a single bicycle tire. No horse had passed that way in the past 20 hours. The lane itself untouched except for that solitary mark. Miss Marple stooped and traced the rim imprint with her finger. A cyclist, traveling at a slow pace, had paused perhaps to deliver the invitation or to surreptitiously arrange another meeting. But no name was affixed to these clues, only that pale impression in the earth, returning to the village green. Miss Marple found Mrs. Harcourt instructing her gardener to collect hydrangea blooms for the church altar. Good morning, Beatrice, Miss Marple said gently. Might I borrow a bloom? I wish to compare the crushed petals from yesterday. Mrs. Harcourt hesitated, then conceded a single cluster. Miss Marple examined the underside of one petal, spotting a tiny smudge of bright red, perhaps paint. Perhaps blood too small to denote much, yet enough to kindle her curiosity. Thank you, she said. You've been most helpful. At midday, she made her way to the old rectory for a spot of lunch with Colonel Fitzwilliam. He greeted her with a brisk nod across a table laid with white linen. Miss Marple, he greeted. I hear you've been busy compiling suspects. Merely gathering information, she replied. Would you care to share your own thoughts? He leaned forward. My guess is someone coveted more than a recipe. Lady Winfield holds considerable influence. She's principal benefactor to the local orphanage and wields sway in the county society. If she falls, someone else ascends. Miss Marple tapped her teacup. Ambition, then, as motive. And yet, so many have ambition in Elmstead. She regarded him shrewdly. You, for instance, have just returned from India restless for fresh challenge. Did you ever consider vying for Lady Winfield's charitable position? He chuckled, though warmth did not reach his eyes. I am content with hunting foxes and sipping sherry. My ambitions lie elsewhere in the chase, perhaps. She smiled. As long as we keep our passions wholesome. He inclined his head. And you? I suspect your greatest ambition is to untangle this web before the police draw conclusions. Miss Marple permitted a small nod. One hopes they draw accurate conclusions. They lapsed into companionable silence, acknowledging in unspoken terms the potency of observation over force. As she left the old rectory, Miss Marple realized that the pattern of alibis, invitations, and village movements formed a tapestry of half-truths, each thread promising revelation. If pulled correctly, that afternoon, she returned to Briarwood Manor to collect her notes. The garden, once the scene of shock, now lay quiet under the gleam of fresh rain. Lady Winfield, draped over the chaise lounge in a wrap of lavender silk, greeted her with a faint smile. Jane, you look determined, she observed in a weak voice. Miss Marple perched on the settee's edge. I have charted the course of many comings and goings. I believe the culprit hoped to seem accidental, an unfortunate fainting spell. Yet between the rustle in the hedges, the cyclist's tire tracks, and a desire to replace Lady Winfield's influence, a clearer picture emerges. Lady Winfield leaned forward. Tell me, Miss Marple considered. She could speak of ambitions and alibis, of threads spun in the village tapestry, or she could wait for one more piece to fall. Soon, she promised. But first, I must learn how the biscuit crumbs came to rest at the corner of your mouth. Were they placed? Did someone watch you break a biscuit, then attack while the act drew no attention? Lady Winfield's lips pressed together. I cannot say. Rest now, Miss Marple urged. We are close to understanding. As she departed, the manor gates closing softly behind her, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of pursuit. Each clue-crushed hydrangea, smudged spoon handle, tired tread in the lane was a signpost on the road to truth. And among these quiet indications lay the key to human nature, truth hidden beneath polite gossip, motive obscured by respectable facadas. Now, with early investigations complete, Miss Marple would begin to weave these strands into a single thread that led to the heart of the crime. And when that thread snapped taut, the killer's mask would fall away at precisely the moment it could conceal no more. Chapter 4. First suspects. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of Briarwood Manor, lending the garden an air of spectral calm that belied the tumult within its walls. While Lady Winfield's recovery progressed under Dr. Pemberton's careful watch, the machinery of official inquiry began to turn. Chief Inspector Braithwaite arrived at Elmstead-on-Avon just after dawn. His bowler hat pulled low against the drizzle. He surveyed the scene with brisk efficiency, uniformed constables cordoning off the hydrangea nook, finger-marked teacup placed in an evidence bag, and a small cluster of villagers gathered beyond the rope line. It was a crime scene now, not a mere accident, and the inspector intended to close the case swiftly. Braithwaite's first interviews gravitated toward those with the clearest motive, or at least the appearance of one. His gaze fell instantly upon Reverend Goodenow, who had been conspicuously pale since the incident. The young clergyman stood at the edge of the garden, hands trembling, while the inspector approached. Notebook in hand, Reverend Braithwaite began, his voice courteous but firm. I understand you discovered Lady Winfield behind the hedges. I'll need your account of the events, in detail, from beginning to end. Goodenough swallowed, glancing at Miss Marple, who stood a respectful distance away. Though she offered him a small nod, her expression remained inscrutable. The curate stammered through his story, how he'd brought the luncheon invitation, promising payment for her biscuit recipe, how he'd heard a faint sound from the hedge and hastened to investigate, and how he'd found her face down among the blooms. When pressed about the state of the hydrangeas, he admitted to noticing a single shoe print one small heel, pressed into the soft earth. Inspector Braithwaite scribbled furiously. "A bicycle, you say?" he asked. "Tracks were found in the lane, one set of tire treads, but I must confirm it. Do you cycle, Reverend?" Goodenough shook his head. "I walk everywhere, sir. I sent my bicycle to the smithy yesterday morning. It's in pieces for repair." "Very well," Braithwaite said, closing his notebook. "We may need to examine that." "Thank you." As the inspector moved on, Miss Marple observed Goodenough's relief, tinged with lingering anxiety. He was nervous, certainly, but not necessarily guilty. A man of sincere temperament could tremble at the sight of death or near death, especially when it involved a cherished friend like Lady Winfield. Braithwaite next turned to Clarissa Danvers, whom gossip had already cast as a prime contender for the thief of the biscuit recipe. She stood on the veranda, her posture rigid in a tailored morning black suit, though hardy elasticated boots peeked from beneath her skirt. The inspector approached with a courteous bow. "Mrs. Danvers, I believe you were in Briarwood Manor's garden yesterday. I need to know precisely where you were between 2 and 3 o'clock. Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "As I told Miss Marple, Inspector, I was at Mrs. Pritchard's shop purchasing embroidery thread. I have a receipt time-stamped at 2:17, and Mrs. Pritchard can corroborate my presence until 2:30. Braithwaite nodded, flipping pages. "Very well. And why were you interested in Lady Winfield's biscuits? I understand you had made previous claims about ownership of the recipe." She inhaled sharply. "I expressed admiration for her skill." "An idle remark, Inspector." She raised her chin. "I have no quarrel with Lady Winfield. I only wish to replicate her almond biscuits for my own family's enjoyment. A family affair," Braithwaite murmured, tapping his pen. He glanced at Miss Marple, seeking confirmation. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly but said nothing. The inspector scribbled once more and approached his next subject, Colonel Fitzwilliam, having been entrusted with security concerns, paced beside the curtained windows of the drawing room. His uniform was damp from the mist, but his bearing remained unshaken. Braithwaite interrupted him as he surveyed the garden from within. "Colonel," the inspector said, "I understand you escorted Lady Winfield indoors. Can you tell me if anything about her manner struck you as unusual?" Fitzwilliam considered. She seemed startled rather than ill, a sudden rigidity, followed by unconsciousness. "But I did notice she carried her teacup by the bowl rather than the handle. A minor thing, perhaps, but odd." Braithwaite's eyes lit. "By the bowl. That could explain the crumbs at the corner of her mouth. I presume she held it correctly." "You think it was deliberate?" Fitzwilliam shrugged. "Perhaps she was so agitated she tried to steady the cup with both hands. Or perhaps she never got the chance to raise it properly." The inspector made a note. "Very good. I shall want to revisit that teacup later." As Braithwaite's inquiries continued, the list of suspects grew longer. Mrs. Beatrice, Harcourt the vicar's wife and hostess of the garden. Party appeared distressed enough to warrant suspicion, she had butterflies in her voice when speaking of Lady Winfield's philanthropic sway. Mr. Peter Holbrook, the blacksmith, claimed no knowledge of the peculiar bicycle tracks, yet his proximity to the stables meant he could easily have tampered with any servant's machine. Even Mrs. Pritchard, the grocer, confessed to overhearing a heated argument between Lady Winfield and an unidentified visitor. The previous evening a momentary lapse in her usual politeness that had, until now, escaped notice. Miss Marple, observing all, noted the interplay of ambition and resentment. Each villager had something to gain from Lady Winfield's incapacitation. Reverend Goodenough would assume greater responsibility within the parish. Clarissa Danvers might finally acquire the recipe that animated local gossip. Colonel Fitzwilliam's reputation as protector of the manor would shine. Mrs. Harcourt would command the social circle, and Mr. Holbrook's standing in the village could rise if he were called upon to repair the suspect bicycle. Yet none of these motives offered the certainty Miss Marple demanded. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, Inspector Braithwaite requested that those with alibis gather in the drawing room for a formal lineup. The servants ushered Reverend Goodenough, Mrs. Danvers, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and others into the plush chamber, where they ranged themselves in a semicircle before the inspector's desk. Miss Marple lingered in the doorway, wallet in hand, prepared to offer insights if asked. Braithwaite cleared his throat. "Thank you all for attending. I wish to confirm several points before concluding for the day." He gestured to Goodenough. "Reverend, you found Lady Winfield at what time?" "Approximately to 45, Goodenough replied, voice steady now. "And you had delivered the luncheon invitation at 2:35. "Yes, sir." Braithwaite turned to Clarissa. "Mrs. Danvers, your receipt placed you in the village at 2:17 to 2:30. After that, you returned to Briarwood by carriage?" Clarissa swallowed. "Yes, at around 2:40. I arrived just as Reverend Goodenough was calling for help." "Very well," he said, glancing at Fitzwilliam. "Colonel, did you remain at the manor grounds after escorting Lady Winfield inside?" "I did. I directed guests away from the hedges until the doctor arrived." Braithwaite nodded. He looked across the group, brow furrowed. "It appears Lady Winfield's collapse occurred between 2:35 and 2:45. The bicycle tracks in the lane suggest someone arrived shortly before that. The single heel print points to a woman's shoe. My current working theory is that someone slipped an irritant, perhaps laced into a biscuit, to cause a fainting spell, making it appear accidental." He paused. "That irritant remains unconfirmed." Whispers rippled through the assembly. Colonel Fitzwilliam straightened, and Reverend Goodenough lowered his gaze, while Clarissa Danvers's face paled. Miss Marple watched them keenly, noting the tremor in Mrs. Harcourt's hands as she clasped her handbag, the unnatural stillness of Mr. Holbrook's stance, the twitch at the corner of Mrs. Pritchard's lip. "Yes," Braithwaite continued, "we shall examine every biscuit, every crumb, every teacup. Tomorrow, I shall have a clearer picture. Until then, you are all free to rest, though I expect full cooperation should further questions arise." With that, he dismissed them. The suspects filed out in silence, each absorbed in their own defensive thoughts. Miss Marple remained behind, and the inspector closed his notebook. "Miss Marple," he said, "I appreciate your earlier assistance. You've pointed out several details I might have overlooked." She inclined her head. "I'm always happy to help. Sometimes a fresh perspective, especially one accustomed to human quirks, can be useful." He frowned. "You don't believe in foul play." "I believe in possibilities," she replied. "But the simplest explanation is rarely the right one when human nature is involved." Braithwaite regarded her thoughtfully. "I shall keep that in mind. Good night, Miss Marple. Good night, Inspector." As the long shadows of evening stretched across the polished floorboards, Miss Marple gathered her notebook and stepped into the crisp air. The silence of the manor grounds was broken only by a distant dog's howl and the drip of water from the eaves. In that hush, she allowed her mind to wander back through the day's observations, the broken timeline, the scuffle behind the hedges, the bicycle tracks, the conflicting alibis, the pressures lurking beneath genteel manners. Her next call would be to someone overlooked, the gardener's assistant who tended the hydrangeas. and might have heard more than the rest. And then to the cook, whose knowledge of confectionery could reveal how easy it was to slip something into almond biscuits unnoticed. Only by knitting these disparate threads would the fabric of truth emerge unblemished. For tonight, however, she walked slowly toward Cherry Tree Cottage, the gravel softly crunching beneath her shoes. Tomorrow would demand fresh inquiry, but tonight's task was reflection. Each suspect had stepped forward, bearing their own secrets and grievances. Each had the motive, whether envy, ambition, or fear to wish Lady Winfield out of the way. Yet a single thread would link them all, the hidden clue that turned a garden party into a stage for deception. And Miss Marple intended to find it before the real culprit could slip away. Under cover of morning mist. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Day dawned clear and cool, the sun gilding dew-laden hedges with diamond light. Yet Elmstead-on-Avon remained under a pall of unease. Rumors of the previous afternoon's tragedy had settled into determined speculation, and the village's usual rhythms, market stalls opening, church bells tolling, children racing manicured lanes, carried a note of tension. At the heart of it all was one small, overlooked piece of evidence, the faint smudge of bright red on a hydrangea petal, discovered by Miss Marple as she pieced together the early movements of the suspects. That smudge, petty in size yet potent in implication, would become the silent pivot on which the entire mystery turned. Miss Marple began her day at Briarwood Manor, requesting an audience with Mr. Carter, the head gardener. She found him among his crew, adjusting the espaliered roses against the morning sun. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she greeted, inclining her head. "Might I have a moment regarding yesterday's events?" The gardener, a portly man of 50 with soil under his fingernails and a kind, weathered face, set aside his spade. "Of course, Miss Marple. Anything to help, madam." Miss Marple drew from her coat pocket the hydrangea bloom she had taken from the village green. She held it carefully by its stem, rotating it until the telltale red smudge appeared in the dappled morning light. "This came from your hedges," she said quietly. "I found it yesterday and noted a small smear of red pigment. Do any of your tools or materials use red paint?" Mr. Carter craned to look, his brow furrowed. "Red, you say? I keep paint for the garden gates black and green only, but the new trellis supports came painted a rust red. They were delivered late last week." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Rust red trellis. And these supports, were they stored here?" She pointed to a small lean-to where several wooden slats lay. He nodded. "I store them under the yew. Only small pieces needed to finish the espalier. I've used a few today, actually. Would you mind if I inspect them?" Miss Marple asked. "Be my guest," he replied, leading her through the dew-slick grass to the lean-to. Under the shelter, several lengths of trellis lay stacked. Where fresh cuts had exposed the raw wood, the paint had chipped, leaving faint streaks of rust red along their edges. Miss Marple bent to examine one piece. Beneath a chip she traced the paint's edge with her fingertip. "This matches precisely the smudge on the petal," she murmured. "It seems someone brushed against the hydrangeas while handling these supports." Mr. Carter's eyes widened. "But who would do that? I was the only one working near the hedges yesterday morning." "Yet the incident occurred in the afternoon," Miss Marple observed. "Perhaps someone moved or rearranged these supports after you left." He considered. "My assistant, young Tom, came by to water while I fetched lunch. He might have stacked a spare piece here." "Tom, you say?" Miss Marple tucked the bloom into a small envelope. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I shall speak to him." She found Thomaston to be a shy lad of 16, his cheeks freckled and his hands calloused from work. He stood by the pump, rinsing soil from a watering can. "Good morning, Tom," she said gently. "I wonder, did you handle the trellis supports yesterday afternoon?" Tom's gaze darted away. "I moved them just after 2 o'clock." Miss Marple sat on the stone rim of the pump. At precisely what time? He swallowed. Around to 35, I suppose. I was hurrying. It looked like rain. Did you notice anyone else in the garden? Tom's eyes flicked to the hedges. I thought I heard voices, but I didn't see anyone. I was concentrating on getting the water before a storm hit. You stacked the spare piece of trellis here? She gestured to the lean dash to Dot. He nodded. Yes, but when I came back I think around 3 o'clock it wasn't there. Someone must have taken it. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, Tom. You've been most helpful. As the gardener's assistant scurried away, Miss Marple turned her mind to the implications. Someone had removed a length of rust-red trellis between 2:35 and 3 o'clock precisely, the window during which Lady Winfield's collapse occurred. That displacement explained the fresh smudge on the hydrangeas. The support had brushed against the petals as it was carried. A gardener's tool might conceal more than just paint. It could conceal motive or premeditation. Her next call was to the kitchen, where Mrs. Trent, the cook, presided over a large copper stove, shaping scones with a practiced hand. The aromatic swirl of baking bread mingled with the heady scent of lavender sachets. Mrs. Trent, a robust woman with flour-dusted sleeves and a crisp white cap, looked up in mild surprise. Miss Marple, to what do I owe this early visit? She asked cheerfully, placing a tray of hot scones on a rack. Miss Marple produced the small envelope containing the hydrangea bloom. Mrs. Trent, may I trouble you about the almond biscuits? The cook's expression changed, her brow knitting together. The biscuits. I prepare them fresh each week, Miss Marple, according to Lady Winfield's precise recipe. Only cream of almond, sugar, egg white, snow coloring or anything. Miss Marple inclined her head. Were any prepared for yesterday's garden party? Mrs. Trent nodded. Yes, 2 baked yesterday morning. I placed them on silver trays in the pantry. No one else has access except me and the housekeeper, Mrs. Wire. Would you mind if I examined the pantry? Not at all. Mrs. Trent led Miss Marple into the cool, dim storeroom. On oak shelves, silver platters were stacked, their contents now removed. A scattering of fine sugar crystals glittered on the floor. Miss Marple crouched to inspect. Near the back of the lowest shelf lay a scrap of rust redwood fiber, tiny, almost imperceptible. She picked it up with a finger. A remnant of the trellis support. Mrs. Trent peered. Impossible. There's no wood in here, only baking tins and trays. Miss Marple held the flake to the light. It matches the trellis support paint. Someone must have concealed a piece in here. Mrs. Trent's lips parted. But who would want to? And why hide it among the baking supplies? The question hung in the scented air. Miss Marple replaced the flake in the envelope. It seems that the support used to smudge the hydrangeas was brought into the pantry. Then, later, removed or perhaps replaced by another piece. She rose and turned to the cook. Who besides you and Mrs. Wire had occasion to enter the pantry yesterday afternoon? Mrs. Trent tapped her chin. The housekeeper checked on the tea settings around 20. Then Lady Winfield came herself to fetch a biscuit before the party. Nobody else should have entered, though the gardener's assistant might have. If he sought cold water for the horses. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you. I shall speak to Mrs. Wire. The housekeeper, Mrs. Wire, greeted Miss Marple in the entrance hall. Her posture prim and her voice clipped. Miss Marple, I hear you are conducting inquiries, only gathering observations. Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Wire, did you enter the pantry after Mrs. Trent? Mrs. Wire adjusted her apron. I checked on the cake display at 2:25, but I did not enter the pantry again until after the collapse, well past 3 o'clock. So you did not see anyone hide a piece of trellis support? Miss Marple asked. Of course not, Mrs. Wire replied. If I had, I would have reported it. Miss Marple studied the woman's carefully coiffed hair, the starched collar of her uniform, And the gardener's assistant, did you notice him near the kitchen door? Mrs. Wyer's gaze flickered. He often fetches cold water for the horses, but I did not see him after lunch. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you, Mrs. Wyer, stepping into the morning sunlight. Miss Marple allowed the chorus of new clues to settle. A gardener's tool, repurposed as a concealment device. A scrap of painted fiber in the pantry. An unaccounted interval during which that scrap disappeared. The window between 2:35 and 3 o'clock had grown murky, but within its blur lay the heartbeat of the mystery. She retraced her steps across the manicured lawn, pausing at the garden shed. It was here, she realized, that the gardener's assistant had dried the supports. A careful observer could have retrieved a piece unnoticed. And if one wished to approach Lady Winfield without arousing suspicion, one needed only a plausible tool and a diversion in this case. The busy tea party. Her next visit was to Mrs. Pritchard's shop, where the grocer had first mentioned overhearing a heated argument the previous evening. The shop, with its polished wood counters and sweet aroma of preserves, seemed an unlikely theater for crime. But Miss Marple knew that petty resentments often blossomed behind sugar sacks and spice jars. Mrs. Pritchard, carefully folding a length of ribbon for a customer, looked up with polite curiosity. Miss Marple, I've been expecting you. Have you learned more about the recipe dispute? Miss Marple produced the scrap of painted fiber. Do you know whose it might be? The grocer's eyes widened. I can't say, but yesterday morning, I saw Clarissa Danvers close to the pantry window, her embroidery thread in one hand, a length of ribbon in the other. Ribbon? Miss Marple echoed. Mrs. Pritchard nodded. She was distracted, looking toward the manor. She left in such a hurry I almost didn't ring in her purchase. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped into the mist-dappled street. A length of pale lavender ribbon, recently cut, was Clarissa's trademark for her embroidery. If she carried it near the trellis support, she might have brushed against it, transferring a microscopic fragment of paint. That fragment, once hidden among the biscuit trays, could be swapped back after the deed was done, leaving no sign but the smear on hydrangeas. Yet Clarissa had an alibi and a receipt for her time in the village. Could she have sent an accomplice? Or might another have seized upon her rumored claim to the recipe, inflaming Mrs. Harcourt's envy? Or even Reverend Goodenough's ambition for a scandalous rise? Miss Marple paused at the crossroads, the day's revelations swirling like fallen petals around her feet. Each scrap of evidence: rust red paint, lavender ribbon, pantry flake, spoke of opportunity and disguise. She realized that the true hidden clue lay not in a single detail, but in the connections between them, the choice of tool, the moment of concealment, the weaponization of a recipe. As she turned toward Cherry Tree Cottage to collate her notes, Miss Marple felt the deepening stir of clarity. The village's polite facatas had cracked just enough to reveal fissures of resentment and ambition. But it would take one more observation, one more fragment, one more confrontation to bind these disparate pieces into an unassailable whole. And when that moment came, the hidden clue would no longer be hidden but glaringly obvious to any who knew where to look. For now, the murmur of elm leaves and the distant toll of the church bell accompanied her thoughtful steps, each sound a reminder that in Elmstead-on-Avon, even the smallest clue could shatter the calmest fouade. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Miss Marple returned to Cherry Tree Cottage, under a sky of shifting gray clouds that threatened rain. Inside, she spread her neatly folded notes across the small oak table, arranging them in chronological order: the gardener's statement, the scrap of rust-red paint, the pantry flake, Clarissa's ribbon, and Tom's admission. Each piece formed a mosaic of opportunity, yet the missing link remained elusive. She sat back in her chair, pinching her fingertips together, and pondered the patterns she observed. It was time to press those whose motives were most urgent: Reverend Goodenough, Mrs. Harcourt, and Clarissa Danvers. Each harbored a secret that, once pried loose, would illuminate the darkness behind Lady Winfield's collapse. Miss Marple's first call was to the vicarage, where Reverend Goodenow greeted her with a nervous smile. His hands trembled around his teacup as she accepted an offer of lemonade. "Jane," he began, flushing, "I hope I'm not inconveniencing you." "Not at all," she replied, studying his pale features. "I wish to revisit our conversation about the luncheon invitation. You delivered it personally, yes?" He nodded. "I did." Lady Winfield insisted on a personal touch. She admired that. "Yet there were two invitations," Miss Marple continued gently. "One sent by post, one delivered by you. Why the duplication?" Goodenow's brows knit. She had not responded promptly to the first. "I thought perhaps she misplaced it." Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle before pressing on. "You mentioned payment for her biscuit recipe. That is rather unusual for a luncheon invitation. Did you have authority to promise such compensation?" The curate swallowed. The invitation was from Lady Winfield's solicitor, Mr. Fitzwilliam's firm. She sought to acquire the recipe for mass distribution. It seemed legitimate. "Solicitor?" Miss Marple echoed. "I had assumed the invitation came from someone within Elmstead." Goodenow's eyes widened. "I did not know the source. I only delivered the card." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Oh, but you did know something, Reverend. You watched Lady Winfield read it, yes? You noted her reaction." He looked away. She was excited, pleased even. She scribbled a note. "All right. I shall bring the biscuits." "I thought nothing of it. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you appeared anxious afterward. Your bicycle was in pieces. Your hands shook when you spoke. I cannot help but wonder if the promise of sale threatened your position here." The curate's gaze fell to the table. Lady Winfield's favor secured the parish's future. Without her, I would likely be moved to a less prominent living. Miss Marple let this hang in the air. She rose, placing her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Reverend. You have been frank." She gave him a compassionate smile. "We all have our fears. Do try to rest." As she left, she noted his relief mixed with guilt perhaps, but his motive was now clear. Ambition tinged with dependency. He had reason to see Lady Winfield incapacitated, yet lacked the cleverness to exploit a tardy invitation. She would keep him in mind, but another confrontation awaited at Briarwood Manor. Mrs. Beatrice Harcourt received Miss Marple in the drawing-room, where pale hydrangeas still drooped in vases, a silent testament to yesterday's horror. Mrs. Harcourt, her cheeks still reddened from tears, offered Miss Marple a cup of tea. "Thank you for coming." "Jane," she said, her voice trembling, "I've hardly slept." Miss Marple settled into an armchair. "Beatrice, you showed concern for Margaret, yet you also hosted the party. You stand to gain socially if Margaret withdraws from her role here." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. "Gain? I did not order this calamity for any gain." She set her teacup down with a trembling hand. "Margaret's influence overshadowed my own. Everyone deferred to her judgment, even me." Miss Marple nodded, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Was there an occasion when you felt particularly slighted?" Mrs. Harcourt glanced toward a silver-framed portrait of Lady Winfield, smiling serenely. "At the Wansford Charity Bazaar last year, Margaret insisted on displaying my rose exhibit in the back corner. I nearly wept. I thought it petty, but she was insistent." "Petty perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but petty wounds can fester. Did you ever speak of this to anyone?" "No," Mrs. Harcourt whispered. "I would never admit resentment." She clasped her hands in her lap. "I was busy ranging the garden yesterday. I did not see Margaret leave the manor before the collapse. Yet you were the first to call for help." Miss Marple observed. "I heard Reverend Goodenow's cry," Mrs. Harcourt said, and rushed to her side. I risk nothing but my pride in this matter." Miss Marple allowed a moment's pause. "I understand, Beatrice." Still, you and I know how fragile pride can be. Thank you for your candor." Mrs. Harcourt's shoulders slumped. "I wish I had been kinder, but ambition sometimes disguises itself as duty." As Miss Marple left the manor, she reflected on the quiet fury behind Mrs. Harcourt's genteel manner. Envy and wounded pride could indeed drive one to drastic measures, but the gardener's scrap and pantry flake pointed elsewhere. Mrs. Harcourt had motive but lacked the means, for her occupancy of the garden shed or the pantry would have drawn notice. She had tended roses, not hidden support beams. Her final confrontation of the day was with Clarissa Danvers. Miss Marple found her alone in the Danvers drawing room, seated before the tall mirror into which she often gazed to arrange her ribbon coiffure. Clarissa's face was drawn, her posture rigid. "Clarissa," Miss Marple began, "I wish to speak of your embroidery thread purchase and the scrap of ribbon I found near the pantry window." Clarissa's lips tightened. "I do not know what you refer to." Miss Marple placed the pale lavender ribbon on the table. "This ribbon, freshly cut from your supplies, was found near the pantry. We know you passed that way around to 40. Clarissa paled. "I passed only to collect tea linens. Yet the paint flake was hidden among the biscuit trays," Miss Marple said, "and you returned within minutes to recover it." Clarissa's breath caught. "I did not hide anything. The ribbon was caught on the pantry latch. I tore it and left it there inadvertently." Miss Marple examined the ribbon's end. It appeared freshly cut, but she noted a slight smudge of rust-red paint along one edge. An inadvertent tear seldom causes such a clean cut. "Did you use scissors?" Clarissa's eyes darted. "Yes, embroidery scissors." Miss Marple nodded. "And you washed your hands immediately afterward?" The younger woman drew in a shuddering breath. "Yes, the paint made my skin itch. That suggests you handled the trellis support itself, not merely the ribbon," Miss Marple said. "In other words, you leaned into the hedges carrying something painted, then brushed past the pantry tray before discarding the scrap." Clarissa's defenses crumbled. She pressed her palms to her skirts, her voice trembling. I did not do anything to Margaret, but I did see someone else handling trellis supports yesterday. I thought it was Tom, the gardener's assistant. He looked suspicious, carrying a piece of wood that didn't belong." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Tell me more." Clarissa swallowed. "He paused by the pantry window, peeking inside. I thought he was retrieving water, but when I saw the piece of wood, I wondered why it was with him. He dropped it and ran when he saw me." Miss Marple pressed her lips together. "That corroborated Tom's visit, but who else had opportunity to place or remove the support?" She offered Clarissa a gentle smile. "Thank you. You've been very brave." That evening, Miss Marple retreated to her cozy sitting room, where the flicker of the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls. She laid out the day's revelations, Reverend Goodenough's ambition, Mrs. Harcourt's envy, Clarissa's witness to Tom's furtive movements, and Tom himself, too young to devise a crime of poison, but perfectly capable of carrying implements. Yet why would he conspire to harm Lady Winfield? She was well liked by the household staff. A single thought crystallized. Perhaps Tom was a pawn. Someone had used the assistant's familiarity with the grounds to conceal the trellis support, smudging the hydrangeas before retrieving it from the pantry. The scrap found by Mrs. Trent had been merely a drop fragment, but Tom's role needed context. Why hide and then reveal himself? Fear, panic? Miss Marple brewed a pot of chamomile tea and settled by the fire, her eyes drifting to an old hardcover of village history. She recalled a passing remark by Colonel Fitzwilliam that Lady Winfield's influence extended to orphans, charities, and local industry. If someone sought to undermine her power, they had to strike subtly, leaving the illusion of accident. The smearing of paint on a pedal was accidental, but the removal and hiding of a painted implement spoke of premeditation. Why hide it in the pantry? To delay discovery until after the collapse. when the scene would be frantic and clues easily overlooked. Who else had access to the kitchen at that moment? The housekeeper claimed absence, the cook was occupied, and the gardener's assistant fled when seeing Dot as embers glowed. Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift to the one person she had not yet pressed, the chauffeur, Mr. Jenkins. He had brought Clarissa back by carriage, fetched Dr. Pemberton when called, and remained in the background throughout. His knowledge of arrivals and departures had gone unexamined, and the carriage itself might conceal tire tracks or evidence of a brief trip down the lane. She resolved to question him at dawn, but for now she would rest. Tomorrow would bring the fruits of these confrontations, confessions, inconsistencies, and perhaps a final piece to the puzzle. The conspirator's web was unraveling, thread by thread, and Chapter 6's confrontations had exposed the secret tensions beneath Umstead's placid surface. Soon, Miss Marple knew the tapestry would reveal its culprit. Chapter 7. Another twist. A restless dawn had barely lifted the mist when Briarwood Manor's household stirred with renewed alarm. Word spread swiftly. Mrs. Trent, the cook, lay unconscious in the kitchen, her cheeks drained of color and her body slumped beside the counters, where she had been experimenting with a fresh batch of almond biscuits. Dr. Pemberton, hastily summoned, propped her gently in a chair as Colonel Fitzwilliam and Miss Marple arrived. Breathless, my word, the colonel exclaimed, adjusting his sword cane as though preparing for fresh battle. Is she poisoned? Dr. Pemberton pressed a slender hand to Mrs. Trent's wrist. Her pulse is slow, but she breathes. It appears she tasted one of the biscuits left over from yesterday's service and collapsed within moments. We must act quickly. Miss Marple knelt beside the cook, smoothing the soft folds of her starched apron. Did you happen to notice anything odd about that biscuit, Mrs. Trent? The cook's eyelids fluttered. In a faint voice, she murmured, bitter, metallic, before slipping into unconsciousness once more. Colonel Fitzwilliam's jaw tightened. So the poison, if that is what it was present in the cottage kitchen, not merely at the garden party. Miss Marple rose, her composure intact, but her mind racing. We have shifted from a single accident or attack upon Lady Winfield to a deliberate attempt on Mrs. Trent's life. Someone wished to prevent her testimony, or perhaps to mislead us into believing all biscuits were unsafe. Dr. Pemberton laid a hand on Miss Marple's arm. I shall attend to Mrs. Trent. Would you care to examine the remains of the biscuit? In the pantry, they found a small silver platter bearing 3 half-eaten biscuits. The edges were ragged. One lay in fragments. Miss Marple picked up a shard and held it to the light. Tiny granules of sugar encrusted its surface, but along the inner edge she observed a thin, dark line to uniform for a crack or break. Observe this, she said, passing the piece to the doctor. A fine seam of discoloration running through the dough. Someone introduced a substance after baking, perhaps by layering it within the biscuit itself. Dr. Pemberton frowned. If so, the killer had access to the kitchen during biscuit preparation or storage. He sniffed the fragment. There is a faint scent of almonds, almost overwhelmed by a chemical tang. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This suggests the poison was not mixed into the batter, but applied to the finished biscuit perhaps. By dipping or injecting, their examination was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mr. Jenkins, the Manor's chauffeur, his face pale beneath its usual composure. He rushed forward, hat in hand. Miss Marple, Colonel, I mean no disrespect, but I must report that my carriage tire tracks were wiped clean before I could examine them. They've vanished entirely. No sign remains on the lane. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the colonel. Someone erased the tracks either with water or by dragging the wheels over fresh earth. This confirms a deliberate effort to conceal arrival or departure. Jenkins sank into a chair. I also discovered that the leftover biscuits were moved from the pantry to the kitchen. Just before Mrs. Trent tasted them, I did that at Lady Winfield's request. I thought to offer her some fresh tea, but I did not tamper with them. Thank you, Miss Marple said quietly, filing away each detail. Rest assured, your assistance is noted. As Jenkins departed, Miss Marple turned to Colonel Fitzwilliam. We must consider who had motive to eliminate Mrs. Trent. She knows too much. The hidden scrap, the paint flake, the missing trellis support. Silencing her ensures those clues remain buried. Fitzwilliam inclined his head. And yet to execute a second poisoning so brazenly, who would risk discovery? The same person who attacked Lady Winfield, no doubt, but with escalating boldness. Miss Marple paced the tiled floor. We must widen our perspective. If the poisoning of the cook was intended to divert suspicion from the biscuit recipe, then the ultimate goal lay elsewhere, to prevent Lady Winfield's return to consciousness. With testimony on the invitation's origin. But now Mrs. Trent's knowledge is also endangered. At that moment, Dr. Pemberton re-entered, closing the kitchen door behind him. His face was drawn with concern. Miss Marple, Colonel, I have treated Mrs. Trent with a mild emetic and a dose of calomel. She should recover within the hour, though her strength remains low. I recommend no further tasting. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you, Doctor. We shall proceed with caution. She slipped into the kitchen to inspect the sink and work surfaces. There, faint smudges of moisture marked where someone had hastily wiped away evidence. On the counter lay the cook's wooden rolling pin, its surface dulled by flour, but streaked at one end with a faint trace of rust-red paint, identical to that on the trellis support. A thrill of realization ran through Miss Marple. So the killer used the rolling pin to conceal the trellis support, brushing the hydrangeas, then brought it into the kitchen to dip the biscuits before wiping it clean. Colonel Fitzwilliam crossed a peer at the pin, and this indicates premeditation. The tool served both as instrument and as container for the poison. Miss Marple's lips curved in a small, somber smile. Indeed, now we know how the poison was introduced by contact with a painted implement, then transferred to the biscuits. But whose hand wielded the rolling pin? Their question was answered by a sudden commotion in the corridor. Mrs. Wire, the housekeeper, burst into the kitchen, her composed demeanor shattered. She gasped, clutching a folded scrap of paper. I found this pinned beneath the kitchen door, she stammered, handing it to Miss Marple. The paper bore a hastily scrawled note, no more meddling, or next will be the mistress herself. Miss Marple scanned the message. The handwriting was hurried, but displayed the same slanted loops as Reverend Goodenough's earlier letter. She looked up sharply. This is a threat not from one who merely seeks distraction, but from someone willing to silence anyone who uncovers the truth. Colonel Fitzwilliam folded his arms. So the poisonings are escalating. Lady Winfield, then Mrs. Trent, and now the warning to others. The killer grows desperate. Miss Marple nodded gravely. And we must act swiftly, for no one is safe unless we expose this person before they strike again. She turned to Mrs. Wire. Thank you. Please keep this note secure and alert me if you find anything else unusual. As Mrs. Wire hurried away, Miss Marple addressed the Colonel. Our next step must be to protect Lady Winfield and Mrs. Trent, and to identify whose handwriting this is. We need to compare it with previous invitations and letters. Then we can corner the culprit. Fitzwilliam drew his sword cane and tapped it thoughtfully. I will oversee security here at Briarwood. No one enters or leaves unchallenged. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment's relief. The village's swirl of suspicion had cleared somewhat. The method was known, the threat established. Now, the identity of the hand that wielded paint, rolling pin, and poison remained the final piece. She paused by the window, gazing out at the hydrangea hedge where the first crime had unfolded. The flowers, pale and trembling in the breeze, seemed to whisper secrets she was determined to hear. Another twist had revealed the killer's audacity and their readiness to escalate. But Miss Marple's resolve was unshaken. The game's true turning point was at hand, and she would not be deterred before the final revelation. With the afternoon's events still fresh, she returned to her notes, pen in hand, ready to chart the connections between the painted pin, the hidden scrap, and the scrawled threat. And as the manner settled into tense anticipation, Miss Marple prepared for the delicate psychological test that would draw the killer into the open, unaware that each move brought them closer to exposure. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Late afternoon. Light slanted through the leaded windows of Briarwood Manor's drawing room, gilding the faded gold of the wallpaper and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. Miss Marple stood by the hearth, her hands folded as she surveyed the small gathering seated before her. Reverend Goodenough in his sober black clerical suit, Colonel Fitzwilliam with his sword cane resting across his knees, Mrs. Beatrice Harcourt clinging to her daintiest china cup as if it were a talisman, Clarissa Danvers composed yet tense in her mourning attire, and Tom Carter the young gardener's assistant huddled at the edge of the group. His cheeks flushed. They had all heeded Miss Marple's summons. "Come this way, if you please," she had said by note to each, concealing both invitation and gentle challenge. Now, as she offered Lady Winfield a small tray of warm almond biscuits prepared under Dr. Pemberton's strict supervision, Miss Marple began her psychological experiment. Lady Winfield, propped against an array of lavender cushions, took a delicate bite of a biscuit, her pale blue eyes reflecting cautious hope. "Delicious as ever," she murmured, as though tasting normalcy for the first time. The assembled watched in hushed anticipation. Miss Marple broke the silence. "I thank you all for coming. You understand that these biscuits have gone through rigorous testing. Dr. Pemberton assures me they are perfectly safe." She gestured toward Lady Winfield. "Shall we indulge?" One by one, they accepted a biscuit from the silver tray. Colonel Fitzwilliam rose to his feet and bowed. "With your permission, Lady Winfield," he said, offering his to the vicar's wife. Beatrice Harcourt smiled tightly, pierced the biscuit with her fork, and tasted. Clarissa Danvers crept forward, taking her biscuit and stepping back, as though reluctant to enter the fray. Reverend Goodenough lingered, glancing at Miss Marple for reassurance. Before lifting the biscuit to his lips, Tom stood frozen, biscuit untouched in his hand. Miss Marple watched them, her keen gaze recording every flutter of the eyelid, every tremor of the hand. "You'll find, my dears," she said softly, "that one must never assume kindness masks no darker purpose. But at least we may begin this evening on a note of civility." She sat and took her own biscuit, nibbling so lightly that her lips barely parted. Colonel Fitzwilliam leaned in, whispering to Mrs. Harcourt, "Remarkable recovery, is it not?" Mrs. Harcourt nodded, though her smile betrayed a flicker of doubt. Miss Marple allowed the brief exchange, then turned her attention to Reverend Goodenough. "You delivered the luncheon invitation twice, dear Reverend," she said conversationally. "I scarcely know which is more polite." Goodenough's face paled. He cleared his throat. "I misspoke earlier, Jane. The second invitation came not from the solicitor, but direct from the manor." Miss Marple's mouth curved, faint as a moonbeam. "Is that so?" She lifted her biscuit. Heavens, how easily one mistakes a personal invitation for a solicitor's request. She tapped her finger on the biscuit's edge, watching him swallow. Goodenough's Adam's apple bobbed as he coughed. Colonel Fitzwilliam, sensing the shift, murmured, "Perhaps the kitchen staff can confirm?" Miss Marple lifted her hand. "Perhaps, but I prefer to rely on human nature." She turned to Clarissa Danvers. "Mrs. Danvers, you claim to leave the village at 2:30, yet your ribbon scrap spoke otherwise." Clarissa's lips parted, then pressed together. She swallowed and said, "I was collecting linens, Miss Marple. I did not handle pastry." Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course not. You merely brushed against the pantry door, don't you think? She tapped a knuckle to her temple. Perturbing, how the mind plays tricks when one fears exposure. Clarissa's knuckles whitened around her biscuit. She set it on her saucer and looked away. Miss Marple's next glance went to Mrs. Harcourt. Beatrice, you and I both know how roses can wilt without proper care. Yet you ranged the rose exhibit at the bazaar. You stood to gain social preeminence if Lady Winfield faltered. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes welled. I resent nothing, she cried. I never wished her harm, only wished her to see my worth. Miss Marple nodded, gathering the threads. Worth indeed, but envy can take many forms. But it is not envy we test this evening. Beatrice sank inward, her teacup trembling in her hands. At last, Miss Marple addressed Tom Carter. Thomas, you moved the trellis supports and glimpsed a piece of rust-red wood. You've been frightened into silence. I understand. Tom looked up, eyes wide. I did see someone tall, in dark clothes, dragging a long wooden beam near the hedges after lunch. But I was young and afraid to speak. Miss Marple allowed this to settle, then leaned forward, clasping her hands. Let me propose a scenario. A single perpetrator, who had access both to the garden and the kitchen, used a painted trellis support to smear the hydrangeas and hide evidence, then used the cook's rolling pin to introduce poison to the biscuits. That person then threatened Mrs. Trent and left the scrawled note. She paused, letting each person absorb this. Colonel Fitzwilliam folded his arms. Clarissa pressed her lips to silent anguish. Mrs. Harcourt's shoulders shook. Reverend Goodenough swallowed audibly, and Tom's face went ashen. Miss Marple rose, stepping among them as if in a private parlor game. Now, consider your movements yesterday. Who among you passed through both the garden shed and the pantry in the crucial 10 minutes? Between 35 and 45, a hush fell. Colonel Fitzwilliam's expression flickered. He straightened, glancing at the curb beside Sir Percival's portrait. Clarissa's hands trembled. Mrs. Harcourt pressed a hand to her breast. Goodenough's gaze flitted to the fireplace. Tom shrank further into himself. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, yet unforgiving. One of you, I believe, had both the motive and the means to orchestrate these events, concealing the painted support in the pantry and then transferring it to the rolling pin to conceal the poison. I merely wish to see whose conscience trembles at the edge of truth. Reverend Goodenough cleared his throat, stepping forward with unexpected resolve. Jane, Miss Marple, please allow me. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket, the same paper he had received the previous morning. He held it aloft. This was not from the solicitor. It was from me. I wrote it in fear and desperation. He folded, voice breaking. I feared losing my position, my home, my life's work here. When she read the invitation and promised to bring the recipe to London, I believed she would abandon the parish. I intended only to humble her, to make her faint, never to kill. A collective gasp rose. Colonel Fitzwilliam's jaw clenched. Clarissa covered her mouth. Mrs. Harcourt's face went ashen. Tom's eyes filled with tears. Miss Marple placed her hand on Goodenough's arm. You pressed the trellis support to her temple to startle her, she said softly. Then, fearing discovery, you used the rolling pin paint still clinging to it to rub the poison onto the biscuits. You meant to delay her recovery until after the auction of her recipe. But Dr. Pemberton's vigilance intervened. Goodenough's shoulders slumped. I did not mean to harm the cook, only silence her if she recognized the support's paint. But seeing her collapse, I thought I had become a monster. He sank to a kneeling position, head bowed. The room felt heavy with shame and relief. Miss Marple's final test had drawn him out, his stumble under the weight of accusation, his confession when confronted with his own contradictions, his inability to maintain the lie under the pressure of observation. Lady Winfield stirred. her voice weak but clear. "John, Mr. Goodenow?" The teacup shook in small tremors. The vicaress gasped, rising to her husband's side. Colonel Fitzwilliam moved to comfort Mrs. Trent, who had been brought in on a wheelchair and was now awake. Clarissa sank into her chair, covering her face with gloved hands. Miss Marple looked to Lady Winfield. "Margaret, he has explained his actions." Lady Winfield nodded slowly, eyes moist. "It was never your place to decide for me," she said quietly. "But your remorse is evident." She turned to the curate. "You must answer for your crimes, but I forgive your fear." Goodenow rose, tears shining on his cheeks. He looked at each villager in turn, endeared by years of trust, now transformed by his fall. "I am so sorry," he whispered. Miss Marple stepped forward, smoothing her shawl. "Thank you, Reverend. You see, my experiment was not to trick you, but to reveal what you could not hide, your own conscience." She inclined her head to the assembled. "Our trial ends here. The police will take his confession as he explains the details fully, and Elmstead may heal, once truth has cleared its air." Colonel Fitzwilliam straightened, raising his sword cane. "Then justice may be served." Mrs. Harcourt dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Clarissa Danvers wept quietly. Tom Carter stared at the floor, feeling both guilt for his silence and relief at the end of fear. Miss Marple, standing at the center of this sea of emotion, allowed a small, compassionate smile. "Let us offer Lady Winfield fresh tea and take solace in her recovery." As servants entered with silver trays, the guests moved to assemble around the hearth. Outside, the hydrangeas trembled in the evening breeze, their blooms heavy with the day's revelations. Inside, the gentle hum of restored order began to rise, a lullaby for wounded souls and a testament to the quiet power of human observation. Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her gaze soft. Another twist had led to the final test, and in that test, the hidden threads of fear, envy, and ambition had unraveled, exposing the heart of truth at last. The game was done, and peace would return to Elmstead-on-Avon, where even the smallest clue could save a life. Chapter 9. The revealate morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Briarwood Manor's drawing room, spilling soft patterns of light upon the carpets as if eager to catch the moment of truth. Miss Marple stood by the tall windows, her gentle frame composed but every sense alert. Around her, the assembled villagers: Lady Winfield, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Mrs. Harcourt, Clarissa Danvers, Tom Carter, and Dr. Pemberton formed a circle punctuated by anxious faces and tentative hope. Even the ever-stoic Chief Inspector Braithwaite had returned, summoned by Miss Marple's discreet note, to witness the final unveiling. Miss Marple's voice was quiet yet carried through the chamber. "Thank you all for gathering once more. Today, we draw the strands of our mystery together. You have seen how circumstance and misdirection clouded the truth, how painted trellis support, biscuit crumbs, and a poisoned rolling pin misled many. But now, the full tapestry can be revealed." She raised a slender hand toward the single hydrangea bloom in a silver vase, still faintly smeared with rust-red pigment. "This bloom marks the first act, Reverend Goodenow's deliberate application of paint, to startle Lady Winfield into collapse. Yet, as we learned, the curate's motive was fear of displacement, not true malice." The Reverend bowed his head, his shoulders slack with residual shame. Miss Marple turned to the small wooden rolling pin displayed on a side table. This implement, streaked with the same pigment, served as the instrument for the second assault, Mrs. Trent's poisoning. But upon closer inspection, she said, touching the lacquered surface, "we find the real motive does not lie with theft of recipes or clerical ambition." She paused, allowing the gathered to lean in. "The true mastermind, someone you all trusted, someone whose reputation placed them above suspicion, was driven by a far more personal grievance." She placed a gloved finger on the rolling pin's handle. This person sought to remove Lady Winfield not only from prominence, but from life itself, to seize control of the manor's fortunes and influence. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. Clarissa Danvers pressed her hand to her throat. Mrs. Harcourt's knuckles whitened on her teacup. Colonel Fitzwilliam's jaw clenched. Even Braithwaite's formal composure cracked. Miss Marple stepped back, her gaze sweeping the room. When the painted trellis support was removed from the shed and used to frighten Lady Winfield, it was done under the cover of the gardener's routine only possible, because the culprit knew the assistant, Tom Carter, would be blamed for moving supports. But the hand that wielded it belonged not to Tom, nor to Reverend Goodenow, but to someone with both access to the garden and familiarity with the domestic staff. She turned to Mrs. Beatrice Harcourt. Beatrice, at the bazaar you felt overshadowed by Margaret's charitable work. You envied her social standing. But envy alone does not kill. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Colonel Fitzwilliam. Colonel, you returned from India seeking renewed purpose. Lady Winfield's patronage had the power to redirect your future, but you declined to seek it. The colonel's shoulders squared. He nodded, understanding the implication, yet relieved of accusation. Miss Marple then regarded Clarissa Danvers. Clarissa, your quarrel with Margaret over the biscuit recipe was well known. Yet you lacked both the skill to engineer the poison and the knowledge of the paint's origin. You merely found Tom's scrap and feared for your reputation. Clarissa's frame relaxed. Her face drained of color, but free of guilt. She turned at last to Inspector Braithwaite, who had listened impassively. Inspector, you noted the bicycle tracks in the lane and their sudden disappearance. Yet only one person had both the carriage and the inclination to use that bicycle and to erase its signs from the earth. Braithwaite's eyes flicked toward the fireplace, then fixed on a solitary figure. Dr. Pemberton, the doctor, who had cared for both victims, had unique access to substances and implements. His medical bag contained chemicals. His kitchen duties permitted proximity to the cook's rolling pin, and his familiarity with Lady Winfield's constitution offered the means to calculate a near-lethal dose. Miss Marple stepped forward. Doctor, you prescribed the emetic for Mrs. Trent and no one else. You admitted the substance was chemical in nature, yet you never explained how you came upon it. You claimed to treat the victims, but in truth, you prepared both the paints and the poison. A hush fell. Dr. Pemberton's cultivated calm shattered. His pale cheeks flushed. He swallowed, eyes darting to the door as if seeking escape. Miss Marple continued, you obtained the rust-red paint from the same supplier. You used for laboratory jars the pigment identical to the trellis support paint. You slipped beyond Miss Trent's notice when she monitored the pantry, applying poison to the biscuits in the pretense of assisting with the tea service. Then, to divert suspicion, you confided the threat note to Mrs. Wire, knowing she would share it with Miss Marple before the police. Blood drained from the doctor's face. He placed a trembling hand on the mantel. No, you're mistaken. I treated them. Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Please, step forward. Dr. Pemberton stumbled into the circle. I did it, he said hoarsely. Margaret insisted on my administering treatments. At her whim, her own ambition made her meddle in affairs beyond a simple physician's care. She threatened to remove me from her service, to replace me with a younger, more fashionable doctor. My livelihood, my reputation, everything hinged on her goodwill. He closed his eyes, tears gathering. I thought that if she collapsed, I could revive her at leisure, preserve my standing, and save face. But the cook, she noticed the tint in the paint, the slight bitterness. I must have miscalculated the dose. Inspector Braithwaite stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. Dr. Pemberton, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Lady Winfield and Mrs. Trent. As Braithwaite read the formal charge, Miss Marple addressed Lady Winfield. Margaret, you wish to reward me with your trust, and I have repaid you by unearthing the truth. Lady Winfield, still pale in her lavender gown, nodded, her eyes misty but resolute. Miss Marple then turned to the assembly. Thus ends our mystery, the gentle physician, trusted by all, whose fear of professional ruin and wounded pride drove him to desperate measures. Let this serve as a reminder that evil can lurk beneath the kindest exterior. Colonel Fitzwilliam inclined his head to Braithwaite. I shall see to the arrangements for the doctor's removal. Clarissa moved to Lady Winfield's side. Offering a murmured apology, Mrs. Harcourt joined in solidarity, her tears now of sympathy rather than envy. Tom Carter, still trembling, found comfort in Miss Marple's reassuring smile. As the doctor was led away, Miss Marple allowed a breath to ease her shoulders. She looked toward the hydrangeas outside the window, their blooms now washed by midday rain, a symbol that even the deepest stain can be cleansed. And so, with the culprit revealed and the threat abated, Briarwood Manor could begin its slow return to peace. The garden party would, in time, be remembered not as a scene of horror, but as the stage upon which the quiet power of observation and the kindness of a single woman unmasked a dangerous secret. For in Elmsted-on-Avon, as Miss Marple well knew, even the smallest clue can lead to the most profound revelations. Chapter 10. Aftermath. First peals of church bells rang out over Elmsted-on-Avon, their gentle toll a hymn of renewal rather than sorrow. Briarwood Manor, once a stage for intrigue, now stood serene beneath a pale spring sky. In the drawing room, Lady Winfield received her friends and staff for a modest tea, the modest gathering a testament to resilience and reconciliation. Miss Marple sat beside her, offering a cup of fresh chamomile. "You look better, Margaret," she observed, noting the restored color in the lady's cheeks. Lady Winfield smiled, smoothing the lace of her gown. "Thanks entirely to you, Jane. You unraveled what none of us could see, fear disguised as loyalty, ambition hidden behind a caring hand." She paused, lifting her teacup. To clarity of heart, they tapped china gently, and Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. The other guests entered, Colonel Fitzwilliam, whose protective vigilance had eased into genuine respect for the manor; Mrs. Harcourt, whose fragile pride now brimmed with sympathy as she assisted Mrs. Trent with sugar; Clarissa Danvers, who offered Lady Winfield a sincere apology and a new batch of almond biscuits this time, from her own kitchen; and Tom Carter, shy but hopeful as he delivered fresh spring blooms, his earlier fears soothed by Miss Marple's kind words. Even Reverend Goodnow appeared, escorted by Chief Inspector Braithwaite. The curate's once shaky voice was steadier now, though remorse lingered in his eyes. He bowed before Lady Winfield. "I beg your forgiveness, Madam, and yours, Jane, for the turmoil I unwittingly set in motion." Lady Winfield inclined her head. "Your repentance speaks for itself. May this parish restore your faith in our community." She offered him a seat beside her. As the group settled, Miss Marple rose to address them. "We have all learned something from this episode, that even the kindest intentions can be warped by fear, that appearances may deceive, and that trust must be earned daily." She turned to the inspector. "Thank you for your discreet handling of Dr. Pemberton's case." Braithwaite nodded curtly. "It is clear that justice and compassion can coexist." He tipped his hat, signaling his departure. With the last inspector gone, the lingering tension dissolved. Guests spoke in low, earnest tones. Plans to restore the rose beds, to repaint the trellis supports untainted by the past, to organize a small fete in gratitude to Lady Winfield's charity work. Laughter fluttered, soft as butterflies, gliding across the polished oak floors. Miss Marple moved to the mantelpiece, resting her hand on the silver hydrangea vase. The faint rust-red smudge remained, now a delicate reminder of hidden truths brought to light. She inhaled the floral scent and reflected on the village's strength. Elmstead's gentle pulse was renewed by honesty and solidarity. At the window, Colonel Fitzwilliam approached. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "your insight saved more than one life. I hope the manor will allow me to remain in service purely for leisure this time." She smiled. "You are always welcome, Colonel, so long as foxes stay in the hunt and out of the garden." He chuckled and offered his arm in mock gallantry. They paced the room together, observing the ease with which the village's rhythm had resumed. In the corner, Mrs. Harcourt and Clarissa exchanged sewing patterns and recipes, forging an alliance born of shared contrition. Mrs. Trent, regaining strength with each sip of tea, examined a sprig of lavender delivered by Tom, who blushed under her grateful smile. Lady Winfield caught Miss Marple's eye. "Do you ever tire of these dramas, Jane?" Miss Marple placed a finger to her lips in thoughtful repose. "On the contrary, I find them instructive. They remind me that human nature, in all its complexity, offers endless